The Dharma, incomparably profound and exquisite, is rarely met with even in hundreds of thousands and millions of kalpas. You can see it, hear it, accept, and hold it. May we realize the true mind of the Tathagata. Today is the second day of this 7-day session here at Mountain Gate in northern New Mexico. In May, which will continue, the session will continue into the first days of June. And I'd like to continue somewhat from what I was pointing at yesterday. This is a different angle on it. And it is from a book by Mark Epstein, who's a psychotherapist, who started Zen practice, actually Buddhist practice. I think he's done Vipassana, Tibetan practice. At least he's been in the meetings the Dalai Lama had in the early years with psychotherapists in Dharamsala. Dalai Lama, as you know, has always been interested in science, and particularly in the science of mind, but also in the science of all the sciences, physics, all kinds of things. And so every year, for many years now, he's had annual get-togethers with experts in the field of various of the social sciences and psychotherapy and regular sciences, and had week-long meetings with these people in which they all shared information. And the Dalai Lama's purpose in this was both to learn, as I said, he's always been interested in science, and also to answer any questions any of the scientists may have had. And often there's a book that comes out as a result of each of these meetings. In this case, this is not one of those books, but Mark Epstein has written a number of books. This particular one is called Going on Being: Life at the Crossroads of Buddhism and Psychotherapy. He's also written, I think his first book was Thoughts Without a Thinker, and has written several other books as well. He's well worth reading. At this point, he's in his 60s, having been born in 1953, and he is quite right on. There is a vast overlap, a wide gray zone between Buddhist practice, spiritual practice, and therapy. And this is why it can be so helpful for people who are challenged in life to do therapy and also to practice Zazen. All of the Buddhist therapists I know have all said that a combination of Zen meditation and psychotherapy makes both of the practices go much more quickly. And part of this perhaps is because of what Eugene Gendlin, who actually was not a therapist, he was actually a philosopher at the University of Chicago, but he discovered that when people in therapy were able to tune into their bodies and feel the sensations in their bodies, they progressed in their therapy quite rapidly. And ones that couldn't do that, it took a long time, and maybe 20 years more, to get any progress in working with their situations and their conditions. And out of that, he wrote a book called Focusing, and this is a classic at this point. It was written in 1982 or 80, I think it must have been 1982, 81, 82, 80, right around there. And I discovered it at a very critical time in my own practice and therapy life, and it was worth $1 million because it taught how to tune in to one's body and feel the sensations that would ordinarily be avoided, shoved underground, under the carpet, because they were feared, and they were feared because they could be frightening or unpleasant. And here is Mark's words on on how he first entered practice and what he had to deal with. This was Vipassana practice, and this is what he has to say, which I think all of us will probably find somewhat familiar, if not really familiar. When I began to practice meditation, a curious thing happened. I thought I was watching my breath, but what I was parenthetically learning to watch was my mind. My teachers told me to note, quote unquote, my thoughts when my attention wandered, but they did not tell me how to do this and how to deal with this relentless process, which could be, it could be. My thoughts were much more plentiful than my breath was. Thinking, I would say to myself as I caught myself. This is a practice in the Vipassana tradition, is to note when you're straying by just describing it. And in this case, for example, thinking. When I was caught in an action of a thought, it would abate for a moment, and I would struggle to locate my breath. But 2 seconds later, I would be thinking again. I was amazed at how tenacious my thoughts could be, and how little they had to offer. Very rarely would I have a new thought. Mostly, I simply repeated the old ones over and over again. I could see two distinct patterns to my thinking, how I oscillate between the two overriding modes. In one, I was the critical but somewhat distant observer, judging myself and the faults of those around me. In the other, I would feel sorry for myself for a variety of reasons that centered on how alone I could feel. I could go back and forth between these two poles, but I was rarely free of the one or the other. I began to think of myself as a character in an old Batman movie, stuck inside a room whose walls are slowly compressing, trying with all my might to hold them apart with my arms and legs. It was very narrow in there. The great bulk of my mental energy was taken up with one or both of these patterns, and I could feel myself squeezed between them. So we don't realize how inane our repetitive thoughts are. We don't realize how tenacious they are. Just try to do a breath. Just try to do 10 breaths, fully focused on, fully present with. And it's extremely difficult to do that unless you've had many, many years under your belt trying to do that. And a lot of the breath, a lot of the escape from the breath, I should say, as he pointed out, is essentially yada yada. And it has some basis in our conditioning, as you could see, the self-judgment, which led to judgment of others, and also the self-pity. And it took him a while to learn how to work with these, despite that at the same time he was training to become a psychotherapist. We can reach a point, and every time we recognize a thought as simply being a thought and drop back into our body, it will make a great deal of difference, and we will gradually progress to a point where we won't be filled with thoughts. And in fact, we may even reach a point where we can choose whether or not to bring a thought up. There's great freedom in simply being present with the energy in our body, but it's not something that we have traditionally learned to do or been taught to do, and usually try to escape from, because, as I said, it is covering up experiences that were not pleasant and may even have been traumatic. This is why it is so helpful to also be doing therapy at the same time. I realized at one point, fairly early on, that it felt like I was being chased by dragons and running as fast as I can to escape them. But when I learned to turn around and look at the dragons, they shrank into little mice and scampered away. In other words, the fear of the experience that they were representing was much greater than the experience itself. Now, I'm talking about basic things. I'm not talking about severe trauma. Severe trauma, you definitely will need to work with a trained trauma therapist, because it can take some pre-work to reach a point where you'll be able to work in that way. There are many ways to be able to do this. Bessel van der Kolk, who has been researching trauma and how to become free of it for literally decades, beginning at a time when trauma was not even recognized in the Veterans Administration, and it was actually forbidden to mention it. And all the terms, such as shell shock and so on, that had come out of the different wars were ignored and often seen as a lack of capacity to deal with the courage that you would need to do whatever you needed to do, like killing people or being in danger of being killed yourself. And it took Bessel a great deal of time and research to convince the VA, which when he started there had erased every mention of any kind of trauma, whatever you want it to be called, PTSD and so on, shell shock, all of those terms, from the VA library. And he was horrified. He was brand new out of psychiatric degree, and it turned to making his life work, researching how to work with trauma to take the bite out of it, to help people become free of it. And there are many, many ways that this can be helped. And I won't go into that, but he wrote a book recently, which has become a bestseller on the New York Times bestseller list. It's called The Body Keeps the Score. And that is, we can have an experience of trauma. And trauma can range all the way from mild experiences as children to being in a war and barely surviving and watching people you knew and cared about killed. Or I can only think of how it is for the children growing up in Ukraine right now. There was a headline today talking about when there was the sound of an explosion, you could hear children screaming and crying, understandably. There are also what are known as the ACEs, the adverse childhood experiences, which were ignored for a long time, but began to be realized and researched. And things that have happened to us when we were kids, in particular, the top one is abandonment. And that abandonment can be something that adults don't really feel is abandonment, but they are felt as abandonment by children, particularly young children. They actually influence brain development, depending on the ages these things happen to. A parent dies, kids move, there's divorce. All kinds of things can cause anxiety and be a source of trauma for kids. And we don't realize how much that can be. It's not really given sufficient attention by the adults. At any rate, there were reasons behind why Mark Epstein was feeling lonely. And I won't go into them now, but they were expressed in at least one of his books. He learned, and this was a major point in progress, even though it doesn't seem like it, that most of what he was thinking was not really thinking. It was just rehashing thoughts, and that there were very few real new thoughts in the mix. That's a forward progress, because before that, all we know is we've got this gray crowd of thoughts that is blanking out like an eclipse, blanking out our deep sensations. And as a result, causing us to live a kind of a half-life, to disengage from being fully present with life, which turns it into kind of a series of grays. Whereas when we are fully present, life is amazing. No matter what is happening, it is amazing. And it goes from two-dimensional and in grays to three-dimensional and full color, sound surround, an incredible experience. Flora Courtois saw that at one point when she had a vision. Flora Courtois, of course, was the American woman who, as a college student at the University of Michigan, before Buddhism really was known very widely in the United States, had a spontaneous and quite deep Kensho experience. But leading up to that, she had a couple of visions. She had a lot of other things. She searched everywhere she could to try to find some answer to this sort of pervasive sense of something more that she'd felt ever since she was a kid, and began wondering if there wasn't a deep truth that was always true, regardless of whatever happened. And one of these experiences she had, visions she had, she called them visions, was that she was in a building, a gray building, in a gray room, at a gray desk, manipulating colored blocks. And that was the work she was doing. And she knew without seeing them that the building was full of people in those little gray cubicles manipulating those multicolored blocks. And one day she decided to turn around and discovered that there was this huge window behind her. And she could look out the window and there was this amazing view. It was springtime, the sun was shining, butterflies were flitting around, birds were singing. There was a field of waving grass and mountains in the distance and a river. And she just was so caught by this that she discovered she could actually step through the window. And she did. And it was so breathtaking that she wanted to share it with the others in the offices. And so as soon as she stepped back into through the window into her gray little office, she realized she had no words to express what she felt, what she had seen. And this is the same as when we have an awakening experience. It is said that it is like a mute, someone who is unable to speak, trying to tell a dream, trying to describe what they dreamt last night without words. When I was a kid, one of my mother's best friends had two little kids, and I, loving kids, used to go up to help with the baby, not the baby, the younger one, who is just, well, he's old enough to sit up. I don't think he was old enough to walk around. And then there was an infant, and he had no voice. He couldn't speak. He didn't cry. He made no sounds. And eventually, he and his father came to visit when he was 12. He still could not speak. And he had been in a special school in Chicago. And that by that time, we were not living in Canada anymore. We were living near Chicago, and so they came by to visit. And this poor kid at 12 couldn't make himself known. He couldn't express himself in any way. I can only imagine what it must have been like for him. At this point, he must be probably about 75, if he's still alive. So he couldn't express himself in any way. He couldn't tell you what he dreamed last night. He couldn't tell you what he ate yesterday or this morning. He simply was unable to speak. There is some kind of neurological situation going on, and it is not uncommon. There are people all over the world who are mute. So this is a difference that vision that Flora had. This is a difference between being fully present and being half present or dissociated. Most of us go around having had experiences in our life or some kind of conditioning where we are chastised, for example, or otherwise begin to sort of withdraw and try to be our best person, but are somewhat fearful about being in relationships, in societies, in public, and it leads to a great deal of pain. The key is to become present. The key is to become present. And one of the best ways to do that is through the Susokkan. As you breathe out, you are extending the breath. You're not extending it right from the beginning, of course, and you're not pushing it right from the beginning. You're just letting yourself fall out, that breath. And then when it gets to a point where it would come naturally in, instead you push it a little further out. And what that requires is drawing your attention to your body. And that is the beginning of becoming aware of your body, aware of your thoughts, aware of your physical experience, and dropping beneath attachment to your thoughts. Mark goes further into this a bit. As I came to see how dominated I was by such patterns, I worked very carefully to begin to release myself from them. I could think such things, I realized, but I didn't have to believe them. Just because I thought them didn't mean I had to always follow them. When the critical thought would come, I could simply notice that sometimes, commenting, judging to myself, when I would begin to feel sorry for myself, I could note that also, and I would then try to bring myself back to my immediate experience rather than going off into an all too familiar and habitual train of thought. As I look back, I can see that was the beginning of an important shift. Something new was beginning to happen. In the place of unrestrained judgment or reflexive self-pity, I began to notice a complex array of feelings. It was as if all this critical commentary was obscuring a range of emotions that had been previously out of reach. Beneath my judgments lay a kind of apprehension or fear, which led, what was behind my self-pity was a feeling of apology. While neither of these were particularly pleasant, experiencing them felt better than avoiding them. They did not necessarily last as long as I would have thought, and they often gave way in unexpected directions. Fear could sometimes become excitement, for instance, as I allowed myself to engage more openly. Self-pity and the apology behind it sometimes dissolved. spontaneously as I became less critical of the feelings I seemed to be carrying. My internal experience became deeper, richer, and more complicated in a positive way. I felt myself coming alive. In psychosomatic language, I would say that my authentic self in the form of emotional experience began to open up to my awareness. I had been secretly afraid of how desolate my internal landscape had felt, but now I was confronted with the reality of my living, breathing, and emotional body. I felt a vitality in my newfound emotional responsiveness that gave me some feeling for what the Buddha meant when he described himself as awake. And then he talks about it was kind of confusing to him at that point because he didn't know what to make of it. And he, by that time, was, I guess, involved in those meetings with the Dalai Lama. And it turned out that the Tibetan language has no word for negative self-image or for actually feelings, and except for one, which is regarding negative feelings. So the Dalai Lama at first didn't really get what these Westerners were trying to communicate to him, because it simply is not an issue in the Tibetan culture, which must be amazing. So back to Eugene Gendlin. That is a real gem of a book. It was incredibly helpful to me. It's been quite helpful to others. I know students who have spent even 2 years trying to become self-aware, trying to allow themselves to feel those sensations in their bodies. That usually comes when we are invested in a very negative self-image, but it doesn't have to maintain. Inch by inch, we can become free by tuning into our actual sensations in our bodies and becoming as fully present with them as possible. And initially, you'll sort of know that you're angry because you can sort of feel it in your body, but you won't be fully engaged in the sensations sufficiently to let it dissolve. It'll still take time. You'll know it has truly dissolved when there's a sense of relief and release to that challenging emotion. And it requires learning how to dare to be present with it. But this is an aspect of what can block people in their Zen practice. And so it's very important to work with this kind of situation. Those people who remain frightened to do so usually quit doing practice because it blocks them in their path. So each one of us, if we truly want to become free, learn to tune in fully to whatever sensations are bouncing around in your body. And like Mark said, fear can become excitement. I remember having a dream some years back where I was a young Native American kid and I was walking around the edge of a mesa. And the mesas have very steep sides, as you know. And at one point, I got a little too close to the edge. And started slipping. And I looked around wildly, tried to find something I could grab hold of, a chamisa bush or something, and all I could see was grasses, which certainly wouldn't have helped me. And so then I thought, wait a minute, this is only a dream. Let's see what happens. And fear transformed into excitement as I hurtled down the slope, and then it changed to a much steeper slope, and I landed at the bottom on my feet, still alive and quite exhilarated. That's a metaphor for what can happen when we allow ourselves to really tune in to these difficult sensations. And the Tibetan Longchenpa, he was a 10th century master, wrote about this and said, when a difficult sensation arises, tune into it in the first moments before kalpa has been, before karma has been enacted. In other words, you tune in before you do something in reaction. And when you tune in fully to this inner sensation, then he says that whatever the problem was is freed in its own place without having to be gotten rid of, and is transformed into pleasant, free freedom. And then you have no compulsion to act on it. And instead, you've gained a measure of freedom from whatever that sensation was. So work on it. Steadily work on it. Recognize that it takes time to undo how many years or decades of automatic thoughting, as Roshi Kapleau used to call it, to cover up any hint of potential pain or difficulty, and how that cover-up actually led to our being so distant from the moment as it is, that it was hard to really function fully and clearly within that situation. But as you work hard to tune in to these sensations, gradually you become habituated to it, actually. And so as soon as something begins to arise, you'll be able automatically to tune in and become free rapidly in that moment, so that there aren't any hindrances. It's quite an amazing process, but it takes some time to unlearn the habit patterns that prevent it from happening right now for you. So I think that's enough for today, but recognize that that is a very important part of Zen practice, and it gets us through some pretty challenging times. It's sort of like when I was a kid, my father was teaching me how to dive into a wave. You dive into the base of the wave. If you try to dive into the top of the wave, you're going to likely break your neck. But he taught me how to dive into the base of the wave. And it's the same kind of thing. You have a sensation coming up, and you just sink into it. You don't try to fight it. You sink into it with a sense of curiosity. You know, what is this sensation really covering up? And what's going on? How does it really feel? And through that, gradually you will become free and able to deepen your practice immeasurably. So thank you for listening, and we'll stop now and recite the 4 vows.